The morning sun cast long shadows across the training grounds at Fort Wellington as Private Danny Rodriguez adjusted his oversized helmet for the third time. At barely 5 feet 4 inches tall and weighing in at 130 pounds. Soaking wet, Danny looked more like someone's little brother who had wandered into the wrong place than an actual soldier. "Hey, look what the recruitment office dragged in," called out Private Johnson, a towering 6'2" mountain of muscle from Texas. Did they start accepting applications from high school kids now? The group of recruits gathered around the morning assembly point erupted in laughter. Danny kept his eyes forward, standing at attention like he'd been taught, but his ears burned with embarrassment. This wasn't new. Ever since he'd arrived at basic training 6 weeks ago, the jokes hadn't stopped. "I swear, Rodriguez, you look like one of those toy soldiers my nephew plays with," added Private Thompson, slapping his knee. "All dressed up in a uniform that's 3 sizes too big. Maybe we should call you Toy Soldier from now on." The nickname stuck like glue. Within days, even the drill instructors had started using it. Staff Sergeant Williams, a gruff man with 20 years of service under his belt, barely acknowledged Danny's existence during roll call. "Toy Soldier, front and center," he'd bark, and Danny would step forward while trying to ignore the snickers from his fellow recruits. But Danny had learned something important during his childhood in the rough neighborhoods of East Los Angeles. When you're small, you survive by being smart, not by fighting back. So he kept his mouth shut, did his duties, and tried to blend into the background as much as possible. During physical training, Danny struggled to keep up with the larger men. While they effortlessly knocked out push-ups and pull-ups, he had to give everything just to meet the minimum requirements. The obstacle course was particularly brutal. What took the others seconds to climb over, Danny had to approach strategically, using technique instead of brute strength. "Come on, Toy Soldier, my grandmother moves faster than that," Johnson would shout as Danny carefully navigated the rope climb or the wall traverse. The others would laugh, but Danny noticed something they didn't. While they were busy making jokes, he was actually completing every exercise correctly. His form was perfect, his technique was sound, and he never gave up. In the mess hall, Danny usually sat alone at the end of a long table, methodically eating his meals while listening to the conversations around him. The other recruits talked about their hometowns, their girlfriends, their plans after military service. Danny never joined in. When someone occasionally asked him a direct question, he'd give short, polite answers that revealed nothing personal. "Where you from, Toy Soldier?" Private Anderson asked one evening during dinner. "California," Danny replied, taking another bite of his mashed potatoes. "Yeah, but where in California?" "It's a big state. Los Angeles area," Danny said, not looking up from his tray. "Got family there?" "Some." That was typical Danny. Never rude, never unfriendly, but never giving away more information than absolutely necessary. After a while, most of the guys stopped trying to include him in their conversations. He became like a piece of furniture present, but largely ignored. The barracks at night were when the real bonding happened among the recruits. They'd sit on their bunks, sharing stories, showing pictures from home, and complaining about the drill instructors. Danny would lie on his narrow cot, staring at the ceiling or quietly reading from a small book he kept in his footlocker. "What's he always reading over there?" whispered Private Clark one night, nodding toward Danny's bunk. "Probably comic books," Johnson replied with a smirk. Something more his speed. If Danny heard these comments, he never showed it. He'd simply turn off his small reading light, place his book carefully back in his footlocker, and settle in for sleep. Morning would come early, and with it, another day of training, another day of being the unit's unofficial mascot. The truth was, Danny had developed thick skin over the years. Growing up small in a tough neighborhood meant dealing with bullies was nothing new. The military version wasn't much different from what he'd faced in high school, except here, everyone was dressed the same and following the same rules. What his fellow soldiers didn't realize was that Danny was always watching, always listening, always learning. While they focused on the physical challenges of training, he was absorbing everything else. He noticed which drill instructors had which responsibilities. He memorized the daily schedules down to the minute, and he studied the base layout with the intensity of someone preparing for a test. During weapons training, while the others struggled to remember the parts of their rifles, Danny could disassemble and reassemble his weapon with his eyes closed. When they practiced radio communication, his transmissions were always crystal clear and followed proper protocol exactly. In navigation exercises, he never got lost, even when the terrain was unfamiliar. How'd the toy soldier get there so fast? Staff Sergeant Williams muttered one afternoon when Danny was the first to reach a checkpoint during a field exercise. The question was rhetorical, but it made a few of the other recruits take notice. Private Martinez, one of the quieter members of their unit, started paying closer attention to Danny during training exercises. He noticed that while everyone else was focused on the obvious challenges, Danny seemed to approach each task with a deeper understanding of what was actually being tested. "He's not as clueless as he looks," Martinez mentioned to his bunkmate one evening. "Who, toy soldier? Come on, man. The guy's just trying not to wash out." But Martinez had started to see what others missed. When their unit got lost during a night navigation exercise, it was Danny who quietly suggested the correct direction. When their radio communication exercise went sideways, Danny stepped in with proper procedure that got them back on track. He never made a big deal about it, never tried to take credit, but he was consistently the one with the right answers when things got complicated. The other recruits were too busy with their own struggles to notice these patterns. Basic training was hard enough without paying attention to what the smallest guy in the unit was doing. They were focused on surviving the physical demands, passing their tests, and counting down the days until graduation. Danny, meanwhile, continued his routine of quiet competence. He made his bunk with hospital corners that could bounce a quarter. His uniform was always perfectly pressed and properly arranged. His equipment was maintained to standards that exceeded requirements. When inspections came, he never had any deficiencies, never drew attention to himself for the wrong reasons. The weeks rolled by, and the dynamic never changed. Danny remained the unit's toy soldier, the little guy who didn't quite fit in, but somehow managed to keep up. The jokes continued, though they'd lost some of their edge as everyone got used to having him around. He'd become part of the landscape, as familiar and unremarkable as the morning reveille or the evening chow call. What none of them suspected was that this entire performance was exactly what Danny wanted. Every dismissive comment, every ignored suggestion, every moment of being underestimated was serving a purpose that went far beyond basic military training. But that purpose remained hidden behind his quiet demeanor and oversized uniform, waiting for the right moment to be revealed. 3 months into basic training, the weekly barracks inspection arrived like clockwork every Thursday morning. Staff Sergeant Williams moved through the dormitory with his usual stern expression, checking beds, lockers, and personal belongings with military precision. Most recruits had learned to keep their spaces clean and organized, but Williams always found something to criticize. When he reached Danny's bunk, something unusual happened. Williams opened the footlocker expecting to find the typical collection of personal items that young soldiers brought from home. Instead, he found himself staring at something that made him pause mid-inspection. The locker was organized with mathematical precision. Every item had its exact place, folded and arranged with standards that exceeded even military requirements. But it wasn't the organization that caught Williams' attention. It was what Danny actually owned. Instead of family photos, video games, or magazines like the other recruits, Danny's footlocker contained an extensive collection of military manuals. Not just the basic training materials everyone received, but advanced tactical guides, historical warfare studies, and field manuals for equipment that wasn't even used at their training level. "Rodriguez, where did you get these?" Williams asked, holding up a manual on advanced reconnaissance techniques. "Military surplus store back home, Sergeant," Danny replied in his usual quiet tone. "I like reading about military history." Williams flipped through the pages. The manual was well worn, with highlighted passages and handwritten notes in the margins. These weren't decorative books sitting unused on a shelf. Someone had studied them intensively. Private Johnson, whose bunk was next to Danny's, craned his neck to see what was happening. Toy soldiers got homework, he whispered to Private Thompson, earning a few suppressed chuckles from nearby recruits. But Williams wasn't laughing. He continued digging through the footlocker and found more surprises. Language dictionaries for Russian, Arabic, and Mandarin. Maps of various global regions marked with symbols and notations that seemed far beyond what a basic infantry recruit should understand. A collection of international military insignia guides that covered armed forces from dozens of countries. "You speak these languages, Rodriguez?" Williams asked, holding up the Russian dictionary. "Some basic phrases, Sergeant." "Just interested in learning." Williams had been in the military long enough to recognize when something didn't add up. Recruits usually brought comfort items from home, not professional reference materials. But Danny's answers were always respectful and technically didn't violate any regulations, so Williams moved on to the next bunk. After the inspection, word spread quickly through the barracks about what was found in the toy soldier's footlocker. The reactions were mixed. Some recruits found it amusing that their smallest member was apparently a military history nerd. Others thought it was weird that someone would choose to read tactical manuals in their free time. Private Martinez, who had been quietly observing Danny for weeks, became even more curious. During evening downtime, he watched Danny reading by his small bedside light. The book in Danny's hands wasn't a novel or magazine. It was a thick manual on battlefield communications, and Danny was taking notes as he read. "Hey, Rodriguez," Martinez called out one evening. "What's so interesting about all those military books?" Danny looked up from his reading. "Just trying to understand how things work. The more you know, the better soldier you can be." "But we're learning all that stuff in training already." "Training covers the basics," Danny replied. "There's always more to learn if you want to be really good at something." Martinez nodded, but something about Danny's response felt rehearsed, like he'd prepared that answer in advance. There was a depth behind his eyes that didn't match his simple explanations. The mystery deepened during their next field exercise. The unit was practicing radio communication procedures, and several recruits were struggling with proper protocol. Their transmissions were sloppy, filled with civilian slang instead of military terminology. When Danny's turn came, something remarkable happened. His radio technique was flawless, not just correct, but professionally smooth in a way that suggested extensive experience. He used proper military phonetics, maintained perfect radio discipline, and communicated with a clarity that impressed even their communications instructor. "Where'd you learn to use a radio like that, Rodriguez?" asked Corporal Hayes, who was running the exercise. "Practiced with amateur radio back home, Corporal. My neighbor was a ham radio operator." Again, a perfectly reasonable explanation that answered the question without revealing anything meaningful about Danny's background. But Corporal Hayes had been in the Army for 8 years, and he recognized the difference between someone who had practiced with amateur radio and someone who had been professionally trained in military communications. Similar incidents kept occurring. During navigation exercises, Danny never seemed lost, even in unfamiliar terrain. While other recruits consulted their compasses and maps constantly, Danny moved with quiet confidence, often arriving at checkpoints ahead of schedule. In weapons maintenance class, he demonstrated techniques for cleaning and maintaining equipment that weren't covered in their basic training materials. When asked where he learned these methods, he'd simply say he read about them somewhere or saw it in a video online. Private Anderson started keeping track of these incidents in his head. "There's something off about Toy Soldier," he mentioned to his bunkmate one night. "Nobody's that good at everything without some serious training. Maybe he's just a really fast learner," came the reply. "Some people pick things up quicker than others," but Anderson wasn't convinced. He'd grown up in a military family and had been around soldiers his whole life. Danny's competence wasn't the enthusiasm of a quick learner. It was the quiet confidence of someone who already knew what he was doing. The most puzzling aspect of Danny's behavior was his complete lack of personal connections. While other recruits received letters from family, packages from home, and care packages filled with snacks and personal items, Danny's mail slot remained empty week after week. "Don't your parents write to you?" asked Private Wilson during mail Call one afternoon. They're busy, Danny replied, not looking up from the manual he was reading. What about friends? Girlfriend? Not really the writing type. These conversations always ended the same way. Danny would give brief, polite responses that technically answered the questions while revealing absolutely nothing about his life before the military. No one knew where exactly he'd grown up, what his family did for work, or why he decided to join the army during personal time. While other recruits called home on the payphone or wrote letters, Danny continued his studying routine. He seemed to have an endless supply of military reference materials, though no one ever saw him receive packages or make purchases at the base exchange. Staff Sergeant Williams began paying closer attention to Danny during training exercises. He noticed that when the unit faced complex tactical problems, Danny would quietly observe for a few minutes before suggesting solutions that were often more sophisticated than what the training scenario actually required. How'd you come up with that approach, Rodriguez? Williams asked after Danny had suggested a flanking maneuver during a simulated combat exercise. Just seemed logical, Sergeant. If you position the team here and create a distraction there, you can accomplish the objective with minimal risk. Williams studied Danny's face, looking for any sign of where this tactical thinking had come from. But Danny's expression remained neutral and respectful, giving away nothing beyond what he had already said. The weeks continued, and Danny remained an enigma wrapped in an oversized uniform. His fellow recruits had grown accustomed to his quiet competence, but they still had no real idea who he was or where he'd come from. The toy soldier nickname had stuck, but increasingly, those who paid attention realized there was far more to Danny Rodriguez than anyone had initially assumed. Tuesday morning started like any other day at Fort Wellington, with the usual routine of morning reveille, chow, and preparation for training exercises. What nobody knew was that this particular Tuesday would change everything for Danny Rodriguez and his entire unit. General Patricia Harrison had arrived at the base the night before for her quarterly inspection tour. At 52 years old, she was one of the youngest female generals in the Army, known for her sharp mind and attention to detail that had earned her rapid promotions through the ranks. Her visits weren't just ceremonial appearances. She actually examined training procedures, evaluated personnel, and made recommendations that could affect entire military careers. The general's morning schedule included observing various training exercises across the base. She moved from location to location with her small entourage of aides and base commanders, watching everything with the practiced eye of someone who had spent 30 years in military service. Around 10:30 that morning, General Harrison's group approached the tactical training area where Danny's unit was struggling with a particularly challenging exercise. The scenario involved navigating through a simulated enemy territory while maintaining communication and achieving specific objectives within a time limit. For the past hour, the unit had failed 3 attempts at completing the exercise successfully. Each time, they'd made the same fundamental mistakes, approaching the problem with brute force rather than strategic thinking. Their 4th attempt was going just as poorly as the previous 3. Staff Sergeant Williams stood at the observation point, growing increasingly frustrated with his recruits' performance. Come on, people, use your heads. This isn't about running faster or shooting straighter. It's about thinking your way through the problem. But the recruits kept making the same errors. Private Johnson and his group were trying to advance directly through the most heavily defended area instead of finding alternative routes. Private Thompson's team had lost radio contact because they hadn't established proper communication protocols. The entire exercise was falling apart due to poor coordination and tactical awareness. General Harrison watched the chaos unfold with professional interest. She'd seen countless training exercises over the years, and this one was displaying all the typical problems of inexperienced recruits. They had the physical skills, but lacked the strategic thinking that separated good soldiers from great ones. Danny stood apart from the main group, positioned near a small rise that gave him a clear view of the entire training area. While his fellow recruits argued about the best approach or complained about the difficulty of the exercise, Danny simply observed. His eyes moved methodically across the terrain, analyzing sight lines, defensive positions, and potential approach routes. General Harrison noticed the small soldier standing alone and found herself curious about why he wasn't participating in the discussions. From her position, she could see that he was studying the exercise layout with an intensity that seemed different from the casual observation of someone waiting for orders. "Why isn't that soldier participating?" she asked Colonel Bradley, the base commander walking beside her. "Which one, ma'am?" "The shorter one, standing by himself near the hill." Colonel Bradley followed her gaze and spotted Danny. "Oh, that's Rodriguez. The other recruits call him Toy Soldier. Well, he tries hard, but he's not really leadership material." General Harrison continued watching Danny as the exercise progressed. What she saw didn't match the colonel's description. While the other recruits were focused on immediate problems, Danny seemed to be analyzing the entire scenario from a broader strategic perspective. After the fourth failed attempt, Staff Sergeant Williams gathered the unit for debriefing. His frustration was obvious as he addressed the group. "All right, listen up. 4 attempts, 4 failures. The enemy would have eliminated all of you by now. Does anyone have any ideas about what we're doing wrong?" The usual suspects spoke up. First, Johnson suggested they needed to move faster. Thompson thought they should use different equipment. Anderson proposed splitting into smaller teams. Each suggestion focused on tactical adjustments rather than addressing the fundamental strategic problems. Danny remained silent during these exchanges, as he typically did. But General Harrison noticed that his posture had changed slightly. He was listening to each suggestion with what appeared to be growing concern, as if he was hearing people miss obvious solutions to a simple problem. "What about you, Rodriguez?" Staff Sergeant Williams asked, perhaps remembering that Danny had occasionally offered helpful insights during previous exercises. "Any thoughts on how we can improve our approach?" The other recruits turned to look at Danny, with expressions ranging from mild curiosity to barely concealed amusement. The idea that their toy soldier might have tactical insights worth hearing struck most of them as slightly ridiculous. Danny hesitated for a moment, glancing around at his fellow soldiers before focusing on Staff Sergeant Williams. "Well, Sergeant, the main issue seems to be that we're treating this like 4 separate problems instead of one coordinated mission." "Go on," Williams encouraged, sensing that Danny might actually have something useful to contribute. "The exercise is designed to test integrated operations," Danny continued, his voice growing more confident as he warmed to the subject. "But we've been approaching each objective independently. If we establish overwatch positions here and here," he pointed to specific locations on the terrain, "we can provide covering fire for the advance team while the communications group maintains contact from this elevated position." General Harrison found herself leaning forward slightly, paying closer attention to what the small recruit was saying. His analysis wasn't just correct. It demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of combined arms tactics that typically took soldiers years to develop. "The key is timing," Danny continued. "Instead of everyone moving at once, we need sequential phases. First team establishes the overwatch. Second team begins the advance under cover. Third team provides suppressing fire to mask the main assault. And the communications team coordinates everything from the command position." Staff Sergeant Williams was nodding slowly. Danny's approach addressed every major problem they'd encountered during their previous attempts. But what struck Williams as unusual was the terminology Danny was using. Words like overwatch, suppressing fire, and integrated operations weren't part of basic training vocabulary. These were terms from Advanced Tactical Manual. "That's actually a solid plan, Rodriguez," Williams admitted. "Where did you learn about Overwatch tactics?" "Just makes sense, Sergeant," Danny replied, falling back into his usual pattern of minimal explanation. "If you study the terrain and think about what each team needs to accomplish, the solution becomes pretty obvious." But General Harrison was no longer listening to Danny's modest deflection. Her attention had shifted to something else entirely, something that made her blood run cold, and her mind race with implications she hoped were wrong. During Danny's tactical explanation, he had unconsciously adjusted his uniform in a way that briefly revealed something beneath his standard name tape. It was just a glimpse, barely visible for more than a second, but General Harrison's trained eye had caught it clearly. There, partially concealed beneath the regulation uniform components, was a small emblem that she recognized immediately. It was a restricted insignia, one that indicated security clearances and operational classifications far beyond anything a basic training recruit should possess. In fact, it was an emblem that fewer than 100 people in the entire military were authorized to wear. General Harrison felt her heart rate increase as the implications began to sink in. If that emblem was authentic, and if Danny Rodriguez was authorized to wear it, then everything about this situation was completely different from what it appeared to be. She continued watching Danny as he finished his tactical explanation and returned to his typical quiet demeanor. But now she was seeing him through entirely different eyes. The mysterious competence, the advanced knowledge, the lack of personal background, the perfect military bearing despite his apparent inexperience, it all suddenly made sense in a way that was both alarming and impressive. The general realized she was looking at someone who wasn't what he appeared to be at all. The question was whether she was witnessing a security breach of massive proportions, or whether she had just stumbled upon an operation so classified that even she might not have clearance to know about it. General Harrison tried to maintain her composure as the training exercise continued, but her mind was racing. The brief glimpse of that restricted emblem had shaken her more than she cared to admit. She had seen that particular insignia only a handful of times in her 30-year career, and each time it had been attached to operations that existed in the deepest shadows of military intelligence. As Danny's unit attempted their fifth try at the tactical exercise, this time following his suggested approach, the general found herself studying the young man with completely new eyes. Every movement, every gesture, every word he had spoken suddenly took on different meaning when viewed through the lens of what that emblem represented. The exercise was proceeding flawlessly now. Danny's tactical plan was being executed with precision that surprised even Staff Sergeant Williams. The recruits were moving with coordination they hadn't displayed in previous attempts, following a strategy that was working exactly as Danny had predicted. But General Harrison wasn't watching the exercise anymore. She was watching Danny himself, looking for any other signs that might confirm what she thought she had seen. The way he stood, the way he observed the action, the subtle confidence in his posture, none of it matched the profile of a struggling basic training recruit. "Colonel Bradley," she said quietly to the base commander beside her, "I need you to pull Private Rodriguez's personnel file immediately. Bring it to my temporary office within the hour." "Is there a problem, ma'am?" Bradley asked, noting the tension in her voice. "Just do it, Colonel. And I need it done discreetly. Don't involve anyone else in the request." Bradley nodded, recognizing the tone of an order that wasn't to be questioned. He quietly stepped away from the group and spoke into his radio, making arrangements to retrieve Danny's file from personnel records. The exercise concluded successfully, with the unit achieving all their objectives in record time. Staff Sergeant Williams was clearly pleased with the improved performance, though he seemed puzzled by the dramatic improvement that had followed Danny's suggestions. "Outstanding work, people," Williams announced to the assembled recruits. "That's the kind of coordination and tactical thinking been trying to get you to display for weeks." "Rodriguez, excellent analysis of the problem." Danny nodded respectfully, but didn't seem particularly pleased with the praise. If anything, he appeared slightly uncomfortable with the attention, as if he preferred to remain unnoticed. General Harrison continued observing as the unit was dismissed for their next training rotation. She watched Danny gather his equipment with the same methodical precision she had noticed earlier. Everything he did seemed deliberate and professional in a way that went beyond basic military training. An hour later, Colonel Bradley knocked on the door of the temporary office that had been set up for the general's use during her inspection visit. He entered carrying a thin manila folder that looked suspiciously light for a complete personnel file. "Here's Rodriguez's file, ma'am," Bradley said, placing it on her desk. "Though I have to say, it's pretty minimal compared to most recruit files." General Harrison opened the folder and immediately understood what Bradley meant. Danny's personnel File contained the absolute minimum required documentation and nothing more. Basic personal information, medical records, test scores from training all present and accounted for, but with no depth or detail that would provide real insight into his background. His listed place of birth was Los Angeles, California. Previous occupation was listed as unemployed. Education showed high school graduation, but no college or technical training. Emergency contact information listed only a generic address with no names or phone numbers that could be verified. "This is unusual," General Harrison muttered, flipping through the sparse documentation. "Most recruits have more comprehensive background information. Letters of recommendation, detailed employment history, character references. That's what I thought too," Ma'am Bradley agreed. "When I asked the personnel office about it, they said his file came through standard channels, but was flagged as minimal documentation acceptable. They assumed it was some kind of special recruitment situation." General Harrison felt her suspicions growing stronger. A file this deliberately sparse, combined with what she had observed about Danny's capabilities and that restricted emblem, painted a picture that was becoming increasingly clear. "Colonel, I need you to run a deeper background check on Rodriguez. Use your intelligence contacts, not standard personnel channels. I want to know everything: where he really came from, what he did before enlisting, and who processed his recruitment paperwork." "Ma'am, that might take some time, and it could raise questions." "Do it anyway," she interrupted. "And Colonel, this conversation never happened." Bradley recognized the implications of that statement. Whatever the general suspected about Danny Rodriguez was serious enough to warrant investigation outside normal channels. He nodded and left to make the necessary contacts. That evening, General Harrison found herself walking past the training barracks during evening free time. Through the windows, she could see recruits engaged in typical activities: writing letters, playing cards, cleaning equipment, or just relaxing after a long day of training. Danny was in his usual spot, sitting on his bunk with a book in his hands. But from her angle outside the building, General Harrison could see something that the other recruits couldn't. The book Danny was reading wasn't a novel or magazine. It was an advanced field manual on counterintelligence operations, and he was reading it with the focused attention of someone studying material that was directly relevant to his work. The general moved closer to the window, staying in the shadows where she wouldn't be noticed. She watched Danny for several minutes, noting how he occasionally made small marks in the margins of the book, as if he was cross-referencing information with knowledge he already possessed. At one point, Private Martinez approached Danny's bunk to ask him something. Danny immediately closed the book and slipped it under his pillow before engaging in what appeared to be casual conversation. The movement was smooth and natural, as if hiding sensitive material was second nature to him. General Harrison felt pieces of a puzzle clicking into place. The restricted emblem, the mysterious background, the advanced tactical knowledge, the way he deflected personal questions, it all pointed to one conclusion that was both impressive and concerning. Danny Rodriguez wasn't a regular recruit at all. He was an operative of some kind, placed in basic training for reasons that were probably classified far above her clearance level. The question was whether this was an authorized operation or something more sinister. The next morning brought Colonel Bradley back to her office with information that confirmed her worst suspicions. His contacts in military intelligence had been unable to find any record of Danny Rodriguez in their standard databases. The name appeared to be completely fabricated, with no verifiable history before his enlistment date. "Ma'am, there's more," Bradley said, clearly uncomfortable with what he had discovered. The recruitment paperwork for Rodriguez was processed through a special channel that's typically used for, well, for people whose real identities need to be protected. Protected from what? That's classified above my level, General. But the people I spoke with indicated that someone with very high clearance authorized Rodriguez's placement in basic training. They wouldn't tell me who or why, but they made it clear that asking too many questions could create problems for both of us. General Harrison sat back in her chair, processing this information. The implications were staggering. Not only was Danny Rodriguez not who he appeared to be, but his presence at Fort Wellington was part of an operation that was classified at levels that even a general couldn't access without proper authorization. She realized she was facing a decision that could define the rest of her military career. She could pursue this investigation further and potentially uncover something that would put her own security clearance at risk. Or she could step back and pretend she had never noticed anything unusual about the small recruit that everyone called Toy Soldier. But as she thought about Danny's tactical expertise, his mysterious background, and that restricted emblem, General Harrison knew she couldn't simply walk away. Whatever was happening at Fort Wellington, she was now part of it, whether she wanted to be or not. The change began at exactly 6:15 the next morning, though most of the recruits in Danny's unit wouldn't notice it for several hours. General Harrison had spent the entire night making secure phone calls to contacts in Washington, and by dawn, wheels were already in motion that would transform everything about life at Fort Wellington. Danny woke up at his usual time, following the same routine he had maintained for months. He made his bed with perfect hospital corners, organized his footlocker, and prepared for morning reveille just like any other day. But as he was getting dressed, something unusual happened. Staff Sergeant Williams appeared at his bunk, carrying a clipboard and wearing an expression that Danny had never seen before. Instead of the usual indifference or mild irritation, Williams looked almost nervous. "Rodriguez, you're being reassigned to special duties effective immediately," Williams said quietly, glancing around to make sure other recruits weren't listening. "Report to Building 7 after morning chow. Ask for Captain Hayes." Danny nodded respectfully, showing no surprise at this development. "Yes, Sergeant. Should I bring my gear?" "Just your personal items. Everything else will be provided." The brief exchange caught the attention of Private Martinez, who was getting dressed at the next bunk. He watched Williams walk away with a puzzled expression, wondering why the toy soldier was suddenly receiving special treatment. During morning chow, Danny sat at his usual spot at the end of a long table, methodically eating his breakfast while listening to the conversations around him. His fellow recruits were discussing their upcoming training schedule, complaining about the difficulty of their recent exercises, and making plans for weekend leave. "Hey, toy soldier," called out Private Johnson from across the table. "Williams said you got some kind of special assignment. What did you do? Volunteer for kitchen duty?" Danny looked up from his tray and shrugged. "Don't know yet. Just told to report somewhere after breakfast." Thompson laughed. "Probably gonna make you the base mascot officially. You're already small enough to fit in the costume." The jokes continued, but Danny noticed something different in the atmosphere. A few of the recruits who usually joined in the teasing remained quiet, and there was an undercurrent of tension that hadn't been there before. After breakfast, Danny gathered his few personal belongings and made his way to Building 7, a nondescript structure on the far side of the base that most recruits had never entered. The building housed administrative offices and was generally off limits to basic training personnel. Captain Hayes turned out to be a woman in her early 40s with sharp eyes and the bearing of someone accustomed to dealing with classified matters. Her office was small and functional, with filing cabinets that bore security locks and a phone system that looked more sophisticated than standard military equipment. "Private Rodriguez," she said as Danny entered and came to attention. "Or should I say, Agent Rivera?" For the first time since arriving at Fort Wellington, Danny's carefully maintained mask slipped slightly. His eyes widened almost imperceptibly, and his posture shifted in a way that revealed the professional soldier that had been hiding beneath the recruit's uniform. "Ma'am, I'm not sure what you mean," Danny replied, but his voice carried less conviction than usual. Captain Hayes smiled slightly. "Relax, Agent. Your cover's been compromised, but not by any failure on your part. General Harrison has been briefed on your real mission here, and she's been cleared to coordinate with your operation." Danny, or Agent Rivera, as his real identity was apparently known, finally dropped the pretense. His entire demeanor changed as he abandoned the uncertain recruit persona he had maintained for months. When he spoke again, his voice carried the confidence and authority of someone with years of specialized training. "How much does the general know?" he asked. "Enough to understand that your presence here isn't accidental. Your handler will be contacting you within the hour to discuss next steps. For now, you're being reassigned to duties that will give you more freedom to complete your actual mission." Meanwhile, back in the barracks, the absence of the unit's toy soldier was beginning to create ripples of curiosity and confusion. Staff Sergeant Williams had returned from his morning briefings with a noticeable change in attitude that the more observant recruits couldn't help but notice. "Where's Rodriguez?" asked Private Anderson. During their first training exercise of the day, reassigned, Williams replied curtly, "Focus on your own training." But Williams' tone was different now. Gone was the casual dismissal he had always shown when discussing Danny. Instead, there was a careful neutrality that suggested he had been instructed to avoid the topic entirely. By midday, rumors were spreading through the recruit population. Some said Danny had washed out of training and been sent home. Others speculated that he had been caught doing something that required disciplinary action. A few of the more conspiracy-minded recruits suggested that their toy soldier had been involved in something more serious. Private Martinez found himself thinking about all the small details he had noticed over the past months. Danny's advanced tactical knowledge, his mysterious collection of military manuals, his complete lack of personal background, and the way he had always seemed to be observing everything around him with professional interest. "I don't think Rodriguez washed out," Martinez mentioned to his bunkmate that evening. "I think there was more to him than any of us realized." "Like what?" "I don't know exactly, but looking back, nothing about him ever really made sense. The guy knew too much, was too good at everything, and never talked about his past. That's not normal for someone who's supposed to be a regular recruit." Similar conversations were happening throughout the barracks as recruits began reassessing their memories of the small soldier they had nicknamed Toy Soldier. Details that had seemed insignificant at the time now appeared in a different light. 3 days later, the truth began to emerge in fragments. Staff Sergeant Williams received new orders regarding how to discuss Danny's departure. Instead of maintaining the fiction that he had been reassigned to other duties, Williams was instructed to tell anyone who asked that Private Rodriguez had been selected for specialized training that required immediate transfer. The phrasing was carefully chosen to sound impressive while revealing nothing about Danny's actual situation. But for recruits who had spent months dismissing him as the unit weakling, even this vague explanation was enough to make them reconsider everything they thought they knew. Colonel Bradley, who had been involved in the investigation of Danny's background, found himself dealing with questions from other base personnel who had noticed the unusual activity surrounding a basic training recruit. His responses were equally vague, but carried the unmistakable implication that Danny Rodriguez had been someone important. "Let's just say that Private Rodriguez was never exactly what he appeared to be," Bradley told his staff during a briefing. "His presence here was part of a larger operation that's classified above all of our clearance levels. The less we discuss it, the better for everyone involved." General Harrison completed her inspection tour of Fort Wellington 2 days ahead of schedule, citing urgent matters that required her attention elsewhere. Before leaving, she made sure that all personnel who had been involved in the investigation of Danny's identity understood the sensitive nature of what they had discovered. In the weeks that followed, Danny's former unit gradually adapted to his absence, but the mystery of their disappeared teammate continued to generate discussion and speculation. Recruits who had barely paid attention to him while he was present now found themselves fascinated by the puzzle he represented. The Toy Soldier nickname took on new meaning as stories about Danny's tactical expertise and mysterious knowledge spread beyond his immediate unit. He became something of a legend among the recruit population, though the details of who he really was remained classified. Private Martinez, who had been the most observant of Danny's abilities, eventually realized the truth that the others were still struggling to understand. The small, quiet recruit they had all underestimated hadn't been a struggling soldier trying to prove himself. He had been a professional operative conducting some kind of covert mission, and every moment of mockery and dismissal had served to maintain his cover while he observed, assessed, and reported on activities within the base. The Toy Soldier had been watching them all along, And now, those who had underestimated him understood that appearances could be the most effective disguise of all. Danny Rodriguez, or whatever his real name was, had disappeared as quietly as he had arrived, leaving behind only questions and the sobering realization that in the world of military intelligence, nothing was ever quite what it seemed.